What if Jason's sudden absence isn't just about a break, but something much more personal happening behind the scenes? And what if the way Steve Burton is navigating his real-life relationships is quietly shaping how we see Jason on screen? I keep coming back to one question. Are we watching a character evolve or an actor protecting something deeper? I want to start with something that doesn't quite sit comfortably with me, and maybe you've noticed it too. Jason's recent presence, or rather absence, doesn't feel like a typical storyline gap. It feels intentional, not just from a writing standpoint, but from a human one. And when I look at Steve Burton's real-life situation, I can't help but feel like the lines between actor and character may be blurring more than usual. Now, I'm not saying the show is rewriting Jason based on Burton's life. That would be too simple. But what stands out here is how timing and behavior seem to align in subtle ways that are hard to ignore. Let's break this down carefully. First, Burton's 3-month hiatus. On the surface, it's being framed as a period of rest, time off, personal matters, nothing unusual. But if you really think about it, 3 months is not a small break in the world of daytime television. Especially not for a character like Jason, who tends to anchor major emotional and narrative arcs. This raises the question of whether this break is purely logistical or quietly emotional. Because when you consider everything Burton has been through recently, his divorce, the speculation surrounding his former marriage, and his new relationship, it starts to feel like this pause might be less about stepping away from work and more about stabilizing something in his personal life. And honestly, that makes sense. From a character psychology perspective, I find it interesting how actors in long-running roles often internalize their characters. Jason Morgan isn't just a role, it's a persona Burton has lived with for decades. Controlled, reserved, loyal, emotionally guarded. And now, Burton's real life seems to echo some of those same themes. There's something subtle about how Burton has handled the public narrative around his divorce from Cherie Guston. He hasn't leaned into drama. He hasn't publicly dissected what happened. Instead, he's maintained a kind of emotional distance that feels very Jason-like. But here's where it gets more complex. There have been rumours, unconfirmed, speculative, and honestly a bit invasive about infidelity and even questions surrounding paternity. Now, I want to be very clear. These are not confirmed facts, and I don't think it's responsible to treat them as such. Still, the existence of these rumours matters not because they're true, but because they shape perception. And perception, in a show like General Hospital, is everything. It makes me wonder if Burton's decision to step away temporarily could be partially influenced by the weight of that perception. Not just protecting himself, but protecting the character. Because imagine trying to portray Jason, a man defined by loyalty and emotional integrity, while your real-life narrative is being questioned in ways that directly contradict those traits. That's not just challenging, that's psychologically exhausting. Now, shifting slightly into hidden motive mapping, I want to look at Burton's current marriage to Michelle Lundstrom. By all visible accounts, it seems stable, even happy, and I don't see any strong evidence suggesting otherwise. But what makes this particularly interesting is the behavioural shift that some fans have pointed out. Burton appears to be more physically and emotionally reserved around female co-stars since his remarriage. And I don't think that's something we should dismiss. This could suggest a deeper motive, not necessarily control or jealousy, but perhaps a conscious effort to create boundaries. And that's where interpretation becomes tricky. One possibility is that Michelle Lundstrom might feel uncomfortable with certain on-screen dynamics. That wouldn't be unusual. Acting, especially in soap operas, often involves emotional and physical intimacy that can blur lines if not carefully managed. But there's another possibility that I find just as compelling. What if this shift is entirely Burton's choice? What if, after everything he went through in his previous marriage, he's actively choosing to redefine how he engages with female co-stars, not out of restriction, but out of respect? That kind of decision wouldn't just affect his personal life, it could subtly influence how Jason is portrayed. Because Jason has always been emotionally restrained but not distant. He connects deeply, especially with women like Carly or Sam. If Burton is now approaching those dynamics more cautiously, we might start to see a version of Jason that feels slightly more detached than before. Not dramatically different, but enough to create a shift in tone. And this is where cause and effect chain comes into play. Real life experience, behavioral adjustment, performance, nuance, audience perception. Each step is small, almost invisible, but when you connect them, the impact becomes noticeable. Now, let's talk about the speculation surrounding Burton's ex-wife, Cherie Guston. There's a narrative floating around that suggests infidelity may have played a role in their divorce, possibly even involving a pregnancy. Again, this is not confirmed, and I think it's important to approach it with caution. But here's why it still matters from an analytical standpoint. If Burton believes or has publicly implied that betrayal was involved, then that experience could fundamentally alter how he processes trust, both personally and professionally. And Jason Morgan as a character is built on trust. So I find myself wondering, could this real life experience deepen Burton's portrayal of Jason? Or could it create a kind of emotional barrier that limits it? Because there's a difference between understanding betrayal and wanting to revisit it emotionally on screen. And sometimes actors choose distance. Now, another detail that stands out to me is Cherie Guston's disappearance from social media following the public exposure of these rumors. That silence is interesting. Not because it confirms anything, but because it removes one side of the narrative entirely. And when only one side remains visible, interpretation becomes even more subjective. We might not be seeing the full picture here. And that uncertainty, it lingers. Now, bringing this back to the show itself, I want to explore a few possible scenarios, not as predictions, but as thought experiments. Scenario 1. Burton's absence is purely logistical. He takes time off, resolves personal matters, returns refreshed, and Jason continues as usual. No major changes, no narrative shift. This is the simplest explanation, and honestly, the safest, but it also feels a bit too convenient. Scenario 2. The writers subtly adjust Jason's character during and after Burton's hiatus. Maybe his relationships feel slightly more distant. Maybe his emotional responses become more restrained. Not because the story demands it, but because the performance naturally evolves. This kind of change wouldn't be announced. It would just happen. And long-time viewers would feel it, even if they couldn't immediately explain why. Scenario 3. The hiatus itself becomes a narrative opportunity. Jason's absence could be written into the story in a way that reflects internal conflict, perhaps even emotional withdrawal. That would allow Burton to return with a character who has changed in a way that mirrors his own real-life transition. That kind of parallel isn't guaranteed, but it's definitely possible. And then there's a fourth scenario that I think is worth considering. What if nothing changes externally, but everything changes internally? What if Burton returns, delivers the same lines, hits the same beats, but carries a different emotional weight? Because sometimes the most significant transformations aren't written, they're felt. And that brings me back to where I started. This doesn't feel like a typical break. It feels like a moment of recalibration. Not just for Burton, but possibly for Jason as well. I'm not saying we're about to see a completely different character. That would go against everything Jason represents. But I do think we might be witnessing the early stages of a subtle evolution, one shaped not by plot twists, but by real life experience. And honestly, that's what makes this so compelling to me. Because it blurs the line between fiction and reality in a way that feels human. Before I wrap this up, I want to acknowledge something important. There's a lot we don't know. And maybe that's how it should be. Because at the end of the day, Burton has chosen not to publicly dissect his past marriage, and I think that decision deserves respect. At the same time, as viewers, we naturally look for patterns. We connect dots. We try to understand what we're seeing, not just on screen, but around it. And sometimes, those connections lead us to insights that aren't definitive, but still meaningful. So I'll leave you with this. Are we seeing Jason change? Or are we seeing Burton protect something personal through his performance? And more importantly, does that distinction even matter? Because in a show built on emotion, loyalty, and hidden truths, sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that aren't fully explained. What do you think? This analysis is based on current story developments and remains a speculative interpretation, not a confirmed outcome.